Dr. Mariana Orlandi. I'm the Executive Director of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture, that together with the Salem Center is a sponsor of this talk. I want to thank the Salem Center for this collaboration as a start, because it's a great occasion for us to bring some of our speakers to UT proper. And I want to thank also our speaker that I will introduce you immediately, because I don't want to waste any time with other introductions. But I want to thank him because he also did a great job last night, and we already had another event. So I'm very thankful for his availability and generosity with his time. Before we start, I only want to say that if you're not familiar with the Austin Institute and with what we do and the kind of programs and things we offer, just go take out your phone, www.austin-institute.org, and you're going to find out a lot of programs and a lot of opportunities for professionals, students, undergraduate, graduate, men's group, women's group. There's something for everyone. Also, there is something that is coming up. We're going to start a seminar on marriage next week. And I mention it because that seminar will be an occasion for us to talk a lot about natural law. We are not always talking about natural law, but everything we do when we talk about family and when we talk about marriage and when we talk about relationship is based on some basic intuitions, that there is something right somewhere. And we try during our seminars and our conversational reading groups to understand what it is. What is it that attracts us? What is it that is beautiful, that is true, and that is good? So I'm very pleased that today's talk is going to touch properly on natural law. And you're going to hear about natural law from one of the clearest, most articulate, and also very entertaining speakers that we have in the United States, at least. Maybe there's someone else abroad that can do a better job. I don't think so. Professor R.J. Snell, the Director of Academic Programs of the Witherspoon Institute at Princeton, and Editor-in-Chief of one of the best online journals that you could ever read, The Public Discourse. If you're not subscribed, do it now, because it's excellent. And besides being an amazing scholar and excellent writer, Dr. Snell has been an irreplaceable mentor for some of the best young minds that this country has to offer, being at Princeton. And prior to his Princeton role, he was professor of philosophy and director of the philosophy program at Eastern University and the Templeton Honors College, where he founded and directed the Agora Institute for Civic Virtue and the Common Good. So he definitely knows what he's going to talk about. He knows his topic, and I don't want to waste any more time. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
So there's flattering introductions, and then there's just flat-out lies. You can judge for yourself which one that is. Thanks, Mariana, for having me, and to Tubi and Kenny and everyone involved with the Austin Institute, and to the Salem Center for hosting this. Very good to be with you, and thank you for it. Harry has already told me that he came to hear my heretical views on natural law. You can make your judgments about that as well. So I want here today to explore why natural lawyers themselves disagree in so many ways about how to articulate the natural law, which is conceivably a bit odd if natural lawyers think that the natural law is self-evident, universally held, and accessible in principle to all rational agents. Right? If those things are true, it's interesting that the theories not only disagree, but that the disagreements are so intense and profound. I'd also like to explore in the second part why this supposedly self-evident moral theory is rejected by so many contemporaries. So I'm going to, in the first part, do a hermeneutics of natural law theory. In other words, an interpretation of why there are so many different theories, although it's my own argument that it doesn't matter if there's a bunch of different theories because there is only one natural law. The natural law is different than the articulation thereof. And I'm going to suggest as well in the second part that my own preferred account of natural law, one which is quite close to the so-called new natural law theory of people like Germain Grisey and John Finnis and Joseph Boyle, is uniquely susceptible to a particular challenge, namely the challenge of cultural difference. So if natural law is in principle universal and open to all rational agents, right, we wonder why there's so many theories. And then I want to suggest my own preferred theory is in a bit of a bind, particularly, because it doesn't have recourse to metaphysics in its foundations. It has recourse only to a first personal point of view. And a first personal point of view requires data which is going to be culturally informed. And so the new natural lawyers have a particular challenge they need to face. Okay, so I'm going to critique my own people in a sense more than not. Now, first, a brief sketch, certainly not all of the contested issues, of some of the basic positions that new natural law holds, and then why that's so different from classical natural law. There's even a battle about how to call this. So the new natural lawyers don't like the term new natural law. They'll say the new classical law, because Russ Hittinger himself coined the phrase new natural law to mean novel and therefore false. But I'm not going to go there. This is by no means all. So here's 5 claims about new natural law, 5 bits of their theory. First, basic human goods are intelligible reasons for acting, which means that they are chosen for their own sake and make the action done for that choice intelligible. They're done for their own sake because they're not instrumental, and we discover them through a kind of reflexivity about what makes our actions worth doing. So for instance, money is not going to be a basic human good. No one seeks money for its own sake. You seek money for the sake of something else because money is intrinsically instrumental, as opposed to play, which is a basic human good. So if you've ever had young children or nieces or nephews and you see them engaging in some ridiculous game, right? Like I remember as a kid playing a game where I would throw the tennis ball to see how close I could get to the ceiling without hitting the ceiling. And if I hit the ceiling, I had to do sit-ups or something. If you ask a young kid why they're engaging in that game, their answer will be, it's fun, right? If you ask them why, their answer will be, it's fun. That's what makes it a basic human good. Right? Or if a child came home and said, I'd like to get married, you might say to him, like he doesn't seem worth your while, or now, maybe you should wait. But you wouldn't wonder why there's a reason for marriage, because you would think, this is the argument, marriage is a basic human good. Okay? So if it's a reason for acting, it's a basic human good. Second, there are several basic human goods at different parts of new natural law's history. There's 7 or 8. They're irreducible to each other. In other words, you can't explain play with reference to knowledge, or knowledge with reference to marriage, or marriage with reference to friendship. Each of the basic human goods is irreducible to each other. That's claim 1. And claim 2, and this is highly controversial, the basic human goods are not reducible or commensurate to any higher good in light of which they are good. Now, the classical Thomists, of course, don't like that very much, because the claim of new natural lawyers is these goods are not reducible to God, or they're not reducible to the beatific vision, or they're not reducible to happiness. You have to seek all 7 or all 8, not thwart any of them. None of them will be explained by happiness or the beatific vision or God. Thomists don't like that because the beatific vision is the highest good. Third, the claim is, this is from 94.2 in the Treatise on Law, that they are analogous to principles of theoretical reason in being self-evident. So the principle of non-contradiction is self-evident. It's a per se nota. If you don't understand the principle of non-contradiction, I cannot give you an argument for it because it is the basis of all arguments, and as the basis of all arguments, it cannot be derived from anything else. Their argument is that the principles of practical reason, the basic human goods, are like the theoretical first principles, so I can give you no arguments for them. You have to recognize or apprehend them as being good. But because they're self-evident, they cannot be derived from anything. Okay? Fourth, since they're underived, and now we get into a very intense dispute, the basic human goods can obviously not be derived, this is the claim of new natural law, from theoretical principles of the good, or of metaphysics, or of philosophical anthropology. In other words, they're going to reject all proper function arguments. So any argument which takes the form like follows: here's what human nature is, and because we know the nature of the human, what human being is, we can then determine what the goods proportionate to that being are. That's a very classical natural law argument. They reject that entirely and explicitly, because it would be to derive the basic goods from something else, in this case a theoretical anthropology or a metaphysics. But if the first principles are underived, they have to be entirely underived, so they can't be derived from metaphysics or philosophical anthropology. Fifth and finally, so new natural law doesn't begin with metaphysics, it doesn't start with a philosophical anthropology, and then determine the good. As a result, they won't accept any proper function arguments, they won't accept teleological arguments as the foundation to natural law. Now that's highly contested in the tradition. In fact, John Finnis goes so far as to accept Hume's objection that you cannot derive an ought from an is, which of course most natural lawyers think is not a good objection and is precisely what you do when you're doing the natural law. McIntyre's response in After Virtue is, well, here's a watch. I know what the good of a watch is when I know what a watch is. So if this loses multiple minutes a day, it's not a very good watch, right? You know what it is from which you're able to determine it's good. New natural lawyers reject that form of reasoning, root and branch. Okay? Just a basic primer on new natural law if you're not aware with it. So part one, hermeneutics of natural law theories, a text with which to begin. Let me begin with the following text from John Finnis from his lectures, The Fundamentals of Ethics. Here's Finnis. My concern has been to elucidate the language we use when we speak of human goods and of understanding goods. That involves attention both to one's own inclinations and to the whole range and possibilities open to you. Now here's the key line. By an insight, which is not an intuition. Did you notice that Mariana, when speaking about the natural law, said, well, we have intuitions of human goods? John Finnis says, no, we don't. We have insights, which are not intuitions, because not made in the absence of data. An intuition, he thinks, is made in the absence of data. An insight is not made in the absence of data, nor by a deduction or inference from any previous proposition. So the basic human goods are going to be recognized by an insight, which is not innate, which is not an intuition, nor is it a derivation. So let's explore what we mean by this. I want to unpack this text, and just remember this line, an insight which is not an intuition nor a derivation. I'll unpack this text by drawing on the thought of Bernard Lonergan, a thinker whom Finnis uses himself in his basic methodology, so it's not just sort of quaint to me. Finnis uses this in his development. Here's Lonergan. Human intellect has no innate knowledge of any sort, for nothing is known unless first in the senses. Right? Basic Aristotelian principle, nothing is known that's not first in the senses. Nor do we have an intellect which is in some state of perpetual, complete, perfect act. Our knowledge, thus, is intrinsically discursive. We're reasoning, if this, then that. Here's some data, what does it mean? What's going on here? How does it hang together? That's what I mean by discursivity. And we engage in the performance or operations of intelligence to come to know anything. Now, since nothing is an intellect unless first it is in sensation, the starting place of all knowledge is going to be quidditas rei materialis, or phantasm illumined by active intellect, in older language, or in Lonergan's language, by insight into the sensible data. Remember Finnis, an insight into data. Now the question is, what data? Okay? What's the data of natural law? Now, an insight is not an act of attention or advertence or memory, but a supervening act of understanding. I'm sure if you're a student, you've done this. You've stared at a book and really attended to it and then wondered why it didn't make any sense to you. Or you've read it again and again and again, and it still didn't make any sense to you. Insight does not occur by attention. Insight does not occur except by a supervening act of intelligence, which understands the pattern, the form, the nature, the intelligibility. So this is an act of the intellect, okay? Now, if you pay attention to your own acts of understanding, Lonergan says you'll notice the following things. 1, insight comes as a release to the tension of inquiry. If you don't have any questions, you won't have any insights. 2, it comes suddenly and unexpectedly. Eureka, you think. Now I see. In other words, it's not a deduction. You're not working it through if X, then Y, X, therefore Y. That's not an insight. An insight is, I don't understand what's going on. How does this hang together? Oh, I see, you think. You've had this experience hundreds of times, probably just today. 3, it's a function not of outer circumstances, but of inner conditions. Your own questions, your own attentiveness, your own intelligence. 4th, it pivots between the concrete, the sensible data that you're dealing with, and the abstract, because you're going from the sensible to the intelligible. And 5th, once attained, it passes into the habitual texture of one's mind. Remember what was very difficult, which was then understood, now becomes very easy. Right? Have you ever, I do this all the time. I'll read an old book. I have my copy of Heidegger's Being and Time, and I love to look at it as a kind of mortification, because I love to read all my marginalia. And my marginalia as a young graduate student is underline everything, put an exclamation mark behind everything and a question mark behind everything, because I have no idea what's going on, but this seems really cool. And then you have the one insight into Heidegger, and you never wonder about it again because it enters into the habitual texture of your mind. Lonergan thinks this should all be well within your own experience. Or, here's another way of putting it. One, you have to be questioning or wondering in some fashion. The dullard doesn't have any insights. The curious person has many insights. Two, this is not generally a conclusion or an inference, but a grasp. Three, it is not a passive observation of facts in the world that result in knowledge, and it's certainly not an intuition. Fourth, it does require data about which you're inquiring. And five, it's certainly not innate, but once understood, it's certainly understood. That's an insight. Now, Lonergan continues, insights confer a basic yet startling unity on the entire range of human inquiry. Now he makes this claim, which is quite remarkable, I think. If we understand insight, we understand something about every domain of knowledge there is to be had. So he's going to try to have us have insights into insights, because then we'll have what he calls a basic and startling unity about every domain of human knowledge. Let me explore what I think he means by that. Knowledge is discursive or dynamic. It depends upon sensation, but it isn't reducible to sensation. You can have as much sensation as you want, you're not going to know anything. It depends upon the understanding, but understanding itself is not knowledge. Knowing, in other words, is not a single thing, but a dynamic structure involving, this is Lonergan, seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting, inquiring, imagining, understanding, conceiving, reflecting, weighing the evidence, and judging. No one of those activities could be thought of as knowing. The dynamic structure itself is knowing. The way he summarizes that whole inquiring, imagining, sensing, smelling, judging, and so on is in the following three bumper stickers. This dynamic structure of knowing is experiencing, understanding, and judging. Experience provides the data about which we question. Understanding provides direct insights in response to questions of the form quid sit, or what is this? And judgment is produced by reflexive insights corresponding to the question ansit, is it? Or in other words, is my understanding sufficient to the data? So Lonergan gives an example which I love to use, particularly with undergraduates, and every time I use it, I think it's not going to work. So I'm not going to test it here because it takes too long. But the question is, what's a circle? I think we did this together once, didn't we? What's a circle?
I can't recall.
All right, so what's a circle? Lonergan suggests that people are going to immediately have an insight, and then they will have to judge that it's inadequate. So every time I've done this, it works like this. A circle is a shape, and then someone will say, well, that's too broad. It's too general of a definition, right? It's not a definition. Oh, it's round, and someone will say, that's an oval or an egg. Someone will say, it's a set of points equidistant from a center. And there'll be a brief moment, and someone will say, that's a sphere. Note how we're judging to see if the understanding is adequate to the data. And finally, someone will say it's a set of coplanar points equidistant from a center, and then some math kid will annoy us by giving a mathematical definition that the rest of us don't understand. Okay? Experience, understanding, and the judging is asking whether your understanding is sufficient to the data. Nope, that's a sphere. You judge that it's not correct. Now, noetic exegesis for Lonergan allows us to confirm for ourselves that this is what we do in every and any instance of human knowing that we've ever had, and that we do this in every and all domains of inquiry. He says that what we need to do to have a self-referentially consistent epistemology is to experience what it is to experience, understand, and judge, to understand what it is to experience, understand, and judge, and then to judge that you have experience, which you've now understood and experienced, to judge that you have understandings, which you have understood and experienced, and to judge that you are a judger, which you have understood and experienced. That's what he calls the self-affirmation of the knower, which is, I wish he had different language than that because it sounds a little loose. What he means by that is we now have, his argument is, an irrefutable, transcultural, normative account of how the structure of knowing occurs. It's not just that we experience, understand, and judge. We now know that that's what it is to know. And here's his response. If you disagree with that account, you're going to say that he and I have overlooked some bit of data. Ah, you forgot this about knowledge. Oh, I missed some data. Or you're going to say, you've misunderstood what you've just articulated. Oh, I've not understood. And then you're going to say, what you're saying, Snell, is false. Oh, you're judging. In other words, it's irrefutable, he thinks, because it's a retortion argument or a performative self-contradiction to deny it. If you judge it to be false, and you understand what you're saying, or you suggest that I'm overlooking some data, he says he wins, because that's what he predicted you would do. Now, obviously, this dynamic structure is highly formal, right? It's pretty, there's no content there. Karl Rahner used to joke that Lonergan's method was always sharpening your knife and never cutting anything with it, which is a pretty good joke. But nonetheless, for Lonergan, this is the structure of all knowing of any sort in any field of meaning. Okay, now we get to new natural law. Including in what for new natural lawyers is one of the key distinctions made by Aquinas. So Aquinas, in his commentary in the Nicomachean Ethics, has what for many people, I thought this until I read the New Natural Lawyers, it's kind of a throwaway little discussion where he talks about the 4 orders of reason. So the first order of reason, he says, is the world where we're attempting to understand nature, let's go with nature very broadly, when it cannot be otherwise than it is. This is the domain of theoretical reason, or episteme in Aristotelian talk. Then there's a second order where we're trying to understand what cannot be otherwise than it is, but it's not about what's external to us, it's about our own thought. This is the domain of logic. There's a third order of reason where we're not trying to understand what is, but we're trying to understand what ought to be the case. This is practical reason. And then there's a fourth order of reason, which is the world of making or production, either techne or poiesis. So 4 orders of reason: theory, logic, practical reason, and poiesis or techne. Now here's where new natural lawyers go. You cannot derive any of the orders from each other because they are distinct orders, none of which are dependent upon any others. Now, new natural lawyers claim that most classical natural lawyers have overlooked the third domain of practical reason and are attempting to do ethics from the first domain of theoretical reason. But the world of ethics is not the world which cannot be otherwise than it is articulated theoretically, because the world of ethics is entirely the world of contingency, the world that we bring into states of affairs, that we bring into existence through our actions. There's also nothing morally binding about a theoretical description. So you're able to articulate in the first domain, this is the way the world works. That's a law of nature, right? That might get you the laws of gravity or the laws of weak and strong nuclear force. There's no normativity that you can find. Normativity can only be found in the third order of what it is good to do or the truth of what ought to be. So most natural lawyers, according to the new natural lawyers, are not engaged in ethics at all. You can see the fights, right? Why the fights would commence, right? Like you're going to tell a serious natural lawyer that he or she is not involved in ethics at all. Now here's what Lonergan wants to suggest. Remember Lonergan. Experience, understanding, and judging is the invariant pattern of all knowing. And so the invariant pattern of knowing is going to be at work in the first order of reason, theory. It is going to be at work in the second order of reason, logic. It is going to be at work in the third order, practical reason. And it is going to be at work in the fourth order, poiesis or techne, because it is the invariant and universal structure of all knowing. Now, what renders the orders distinct is not some ontic region. It's not as if the first order is an order of being as distinct from another order of being. Lonergan's argument is these are epistemological distinctions based upon intentionality. So when I'm intending experience, understanding, and judging with a particular heuristic in mind, namely what cannot be otherwise than it is, it's the heuristic or the anticipation, what I'm looking for, which constitutes the first order. I'm looking for something external to my mind which cannot be otherwise than it is. I now have a bunch of questions with that anticipation. I look for relevant data. I understand that relevant data. I judge it. And that gives me the world of theoretical discourse. Physics, biology, I'm thinking sort of medieval understandings of this, okay? Physics, biology, theology, metaphysics. I can also try to understand how the mind orders itself. Now I'm looking for what cannot be otherwise, but with a different intention, namely my own thought. That's logic. I do the very same process of knowing, but with an entirely different intentionality. What is it that I should do? That's practical reason. Or how do I make things or produce things, techne or poiesis? It is the intentionality of the human knower which determines and distinguishes the 4 orders. And so now we have the hints of why natural lawyers are going to explain things differently. But we can make more differences, more distinctions. What's that old joke about Thomas? Thomas rarely affirms, never denies, and always distinguishes, right? So we're going to make more distinctions. If you've read Thomas, you know that he'll say, well, it's true in this way and false in this way, let's make distinctions. Lonergan says we need more distinctions. The distinctions are what he calls dimensions of meaning. So not only are there orders of reason, but we can intend our meanings differently. Now remember, by intention I mean our heuristic or our anticipations. And anticipation is nothing particularly fancy. It's just that whenever you ask a question of what is this, there's not a self-evident universal notion of what you mean by what. So in the Western tradition, what we've been looking for when we ask the question, what is this, includes answers like water, fire, air, form, nature, essence, quiddity, matter, yes? We have different anticipations, and lo and behold, we find different things based upon our anticipations. So not only are the different orders of reason, we mean differently based upon how we order our expectations about meaning itself. Let me give you an example. Lonergan's first dimension of meaning is common sense. Common sense for Lonergan is data in relationship to myself. Data in relationship to myself. This meal is oversalted, it's salty. It's hot in the room. Or I was thinking about this today, I was trying to cross Martin Luther King Drive on Guadalupe, and there's this awkward angle to get to the 7-Eleven, and all I thought was, these cars are very near to me and moving very quickly. Data in relationship to me. The world of theory is looking for a different meaning. It's not looking to explain data in relationship to me, it's looking to explain data in relationship to data. So the meal might be overly salted, but sodium chloride is not salty. It might be too hot in the room relative to me, but 45 or 75 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't feel like anything to me because it's related to a scale of data. Or the car is not moving fast, the car is moving in some relationship of distance to time, right? That's what we mean in the world of theory. Okay, so we have two dimensions of meaning. I can attempt to explain the world in common sense. I can attempt to explain the world in theory. The third order of meaning is interiority, Lonergan says, where now what I'm trying to explain is the making of meaning itself. So this is when we do noetic exegesis and we ask, how is it that I know? And we begin to think about, this is a turn to the human subject or a turn to the person. No longer would it be a third person description of the world and how we know it. It would be a first personal description of the knower. Namely, I experience understanding and judgment. I understand experience, understanding, and judgment. That's intentionality, okay? We turn an intentionality to the operations of the human being, which is what makes meaning. The fourth order of meaning is transcendence, which Lonergan breaks into theology here. That's where God's love has flooded our hearts, and now the world is understood through the meaning of grace rather than through the meaning of nature. Okay, I've got my data set up that I think I can do my cartography. Here's my account of why we've got so many different theories of natural law. They're operating in different orders of reason with different dimensions of meaning. So, let's map. What I'm suggesting, let's think Heinrich Raman, a very famous classical natural lawyer. Here's Raman's account. When Raman does natural law, he attempts to derive natural law by first doing a philosophical anthropology. Here's what the human being is. If you know your Thomas, think, all right, what's the human being? Well, they're a composite of form and matter, or soul and body. They have these powers. They have the powers of locomotion and sensation, of vegetation, a vegetative soul perhaps. They also have desires and they have intellect. Well, which is most proper to us? Well, this is maybe a little more Aristotle than Aquinas. What's proper to us is the intellect. So what's proper to us is the intellect. What would be the good proper to us? Well, it would be an intellectual good rather than a sensitive good. Okay? We now have just done the natural law. But ask yourself, in what order of reason did we just do the natural law? And with what expectation of meaning? We've just started with the order of theory, and we are looking for a theoretical account of meaning, are we not? Now compare that to what I would suggest are common sense interpretations of natural law. Think about how this often works. Now we're dealing with common sense interpretations. They tend to assume that our unmediated inclinations reveal the good to us. If you read these sorts of natural lawyers, they'll talk about natural inclinations and unnatural inclinations. I have no idea what that means. An inclination is just an inclination, right? You have an inclination. What renders it natural or unnatural? You had it. And they assume that some inclinations are naturally good and other inclinations are naturally bad. That's a world of common sense. Or they tend to confuse natural law in the prescriptive sense with descriptive laws of nature. In other words, regularity. This is what happens for the most part, or you'll see this a lot. This is what all cultures do. Therefore, because there's a regularity, that's the natural law. Okay, that's a common sense interpretation. Maybe one of the greatest examples of that is C.S. Lewis and the Abolition of Man, which I take to be not a very good account of natural law, even though it's probably convinced more people to believe in the natural law than John Finnis. But I take it to be not a good account of natural law, because it's a common sense account. Other people think that natural law is semi-innate. It's just in the mind. We can read it off our mind, or we can read it off the world. You see this in the perverted faculty arguments. Think about the common sense natural law arguments against contraception. The human reproductive system works in this fashion. We know that by observing what it does in regularity, or for the most part. And so if this is what it does in regularity, or for the most part, it's therefore wrong to interfere with its regularity. That doesn't follow. Why is it wrong to interfere with regularity? Yeah, that's a common sense interpretation of the natural law. Now, that's common sense. Now, here's another version. There are also versions of natural law, sometimes denial, which start with the position of transcendence, depending upon theology, or grace, or the Trinity. I'm thinking here of people like Karl Barth, or Stanley Hauerwas, or Tracy Rowland, or David Schindler, or the Communio School, or John Milbank, or Radical Orthodoxy. They're starting with the dimension of meaning of transcendence to explain natural law. Now, as for those who understand natural law as within the third order of practical reason, with an intention of meaning, of interiority, I would include John Finnis, Germaine Grisey, Joseph Boyle, and Martin Ronheimer. I'm not arguing for this here, but I also take that to be the proper order of reason and the proper dimension of meaning for when you're trying to do ethics, namely a first personal point of view. I don't think you can do ethics from a third personal point of view. That's just describing events in the world. First personal point of view is asking, what am I doing? What are my objectives in this action? And ought I have them? Okay, but I'm not making that argument here. I'm not pretending that I've just proven new natural law. All I'm trying to do here is say, that's why I think there's so many different theories. And we're not going to resolve those disputes between Russ Hittinger and John Finnis, or Heinrich Rahman and Germaine Grisey, by rereading the Thomistic text yet again, or by arguing back and forth with each other, because I don't think that's what the nature of the dispute is about. I don't think it's about what Thomas said, or what Cicero said, or what Augustine said, nor do I think it's some knockout argument where I'm sort of like going to give you the argument, you're going to go, oh, I never saw that. Right? It's not as if the proponents of classical natural law tradition don't have their texts or don't have good arguments. These are sophisticated, intelligent thinkers. I would never suggest they're not. They're operating with a different anticipation of meaning and a different order of reason. And so the disputes are about entanglements of order and different anticipations of what we're trying to find. That's my cartography. Okay? That's why we have so many different accounts. And my minor goal there is to suggest if we can explain why there's different accounts, the difference of accounts is not an argument against the natural law, because I can explain the genesis of the difference. Okay, part 2. Great. That's a hermeneutics, or an interpretation of different natural law theories. They come from orders of reason and in dimensions of meaning. Here's part 2, a hermeneutical natural law. Here I'm concerned to explore why so many contemporaries seem to reject this self-evident account of natural law. This is not a winning proposition to be a natural lawyer in 2025 North America. Tracy Rowland, in a very funny book, says, it's interesting that the natural law is a self-evident, universal, cultural, invariant point of view, which is believed by 35 Roman Catholic thinkers, all of whom disagree with each other. Okay, fair shot, Tracy. That works. Now, what I want to suggest here in this part is that we're going to need a hermeneutical natural law. We're going to have to take cultural difference very seriously. And this is a problem that's particularly intense for the new natural lawyers, because if you start with the first personal point of view, you're starting with you. not a philosophical anthropology of the human qua human, because the philosophical anthropology of the human qua human, or if you're doing a metaphysics of being qua being, that's not especially culturally conditioned. Yes? But you are, and your data are culturally conditioned, and your language is culturally conditioned, and so are a whole lot of your desires, which are part of the data that Finnis says that you're trying to have an insight into. Let me give you a concrete example. So the second and third generation of new natural lawyers, so I'm thinking here Robbie George and his students, Ryan Anderson and Sharif Gurgis, in 2010 wrote a very famous essay which was later turned into a book called What is Marriage? I don't know if anybody read this, sections of this. So this is pre-Obergefell days. They're trying to argue for traditional marriage and against the legalization of same-sex marriage. I have taught this argument hundreds and hundreds of times since 2010. And I've taught it to people of various religious commitments, no religious commitments, at universities, to high schools, in church basements. I gave it to the argument to my grandmother once to see what she thought. That was awkward. And here's how the structure of the book works. And it worked better in 2010 than it works in 2025. By worked better, I mean students got the rhetorical dialectical argument they were making. I don't mean it's true or false. I mean they got the argument. So here's how the book works. Marriage is a basic human good, according to them. As a basic human good, you cannot give any arguments for it because then it would be derived and wouldn't be first. So all you can do is try to have people understand why marriage is a basic human good, right? Like friendship. If you came and you said, hey, I'd like to be friends, and I said, what's a friend? Why would you want to be a friend? You might think, well, I don't want to be friends with you anymore, right? But you still understand that way friendship is good. It's just good because it's good. That's what they think marriage is. But now, what is marriage? So here's their argument. They give arguments which go like this. There's the conjugal view of marriage and there's the romantic view of marriage. The conjugal view of marriage is the traditional view. Romantic view is that, you're each other's most special people. Okay, so here's one of the examples they use. Jim and Sally are each other's most special people. They spend all of their time together. They share a bank account. They live together. They care for each other when they're ill. They cook their meals together. They have made their wills together. They share their finances. They care for each other completely. They share everything together. Are they married? Now they go back and forth in the text, and then they reveal, well, Jim and Sally are brother and sister and in no way are sexually related to each other. Now, every time, even some of you did this, you just giggled, right? Did you just hear the laugh, the sort of nervous, ah, because I thought they were married? The argument in what is marriage is the intuition that marriage would include a sexual aspect, or the intuition that marriage would include an exclusive aspect, or the intuition that marriage would include a permanent aspect, has as its principled reason only the conjugal view for marriage. There are no principled views of why a romantic understanding of marriage needs to be permanent, exclusive, or sexual. Okay, well, since 2010 to 2025, most students have been raised in a culture where the pill is ubiquitous, have been raised in a culture like an adult culture post-Obergefell, a world of no-fault divorce, and a world where the New York Review of Books and the New Yorker carry almost monthly stories about polyamory or polycules or ethical non-monogamy. I'm making no arguments for or against anything. The argument I'm making is the cultural conditions changed pretty fast, even in 15 years, such that the rhetorical structure of the book, when I teach it now, doesn't go anywhere because people didn't have the intuitions that marriage needed to be in principle sexual, or that marriage in principle needed to be exclusive, or that marriage in principle needed to be permanent. And if someone doesn't have those intuitions, the book has no arguments to provide at all, because it's appealing to intuitions that are culturally defunct. Okay? Now, that's a problem for new natural law because they're appealing to the first personal point of view and the data accessible to people from the first personal point of view. Now, here's how the Lonerganian would respond. First, you have to note that insight is always into phantasm. Nothing is in the intellect that's not first in the senses. And second, an insight results in a verbum mentis, a dicere, or a word, an internal word, the inner verbum in Augustine's language. Here's the first. If insight is always into a phantasm, and if the date of experience is not a passive gaping reception of sense data, which is in principle open to any animal with sensation, but experience always includes some level of interpretation, then we realize that even our experiences are not unmediated by cultural concerns. My experience, your experience, will reveal patterns of conation, interest, or attention. You have friends who note things that you don't note, right? They see things that you don't see. Why? Their sight is better than yours, or they have a different pattern of interest than you, such that different data emerges to their experience. So, because we're embodied, linguistic, encultured, and historically conditioned, we're not all going to have the same experiences. Sometimes we pay attention or don't pay attention. And we're always organizing our experience, focusing, censoring. Think about what you think is noise in a conversation, which you censor out, that someone else thinks is not noise, but is the main point. You're going to have a different experience of things, yes? Now, that's going to include differences of character, interests, and I think language and culture as well. Experience is just thoroughly historically conditioned, I think. Right? We're not just animals with passive reception, and we're not cameras which just receive the world. We are, I think, Aristotle gives a correct interpretation that we are embodied souls, and the body is historical, particular, finite, linguistic, and is in that polis or this polis. That means the natural lawyer has to explain experience. Further, second, insight results in an inner word, dicere, the speaking. It's very much like language in many ways. Because when we speak, speaking is always an exercise of meaning. Insights are exercises of meaning. This is my argument before, common sense, theory, interiority, transcendence. But meaning is always conditioned, I don't say determined, conditioned by different linguistic and cultural factors. Meaning occupies and cannot but occupy a place within culture, community, and history, since persons and their intelligence are not like a Kantian transcendental ego, but a hylomorphic union. The person who's doing natural law thinking is this person in this body, in this community, at this time, at this place in history. So every act of intelligibility, including the intelligibility of intelligence, where the dynamic structure is culturally invariant and transcultural, that's empty. That's just a formal dynamic structure. The dynamic structure is always going to be conditioned by a community fund of meaning and value. The practical projects of any one person, and that's what the natural law is a practical project because it's in practical reason of the good which I'm attempting to actualize, are never hatched entirely de novo. They emerge in accord with available experiences, available ideas, and ongoing enterprises so that that person's actions and intelligence arise in an intelligible nexus that they did not create but inherited. By the way, most natural lawyers don't like anything that I'm saying right now. Right? If you're most natural lawyers think that I've just become a relativist. No, I'm making an argument for hermeneutical natural law, which will persuade no one except myself. I've done that before. Intelligence is the ground of intelligibility. And it's the structure of intelligence which is normative, invariant, and transcultural. But the inclinations of the person and the data available to that person that they're attempting to understand, and the language and live options of understanding that are present and available to them come from a community fund of meaning. That includes desires themselves, which are not normative because they are just desires. So, when we're dealing with natural law's deniers, or indeed even its proponents, I think we will of necessity have a hermeneutical task. And that this challenge is more abrupt for new natural lawyers because it can't give us being or an anthropology which sort of, in theory at least, can leave the conditions of culture behind. So here's the task of natural law. It's to help individuals interpret their own data in keeping with their own intelligence, and to help them appropriate intelligence and the laws of intelligence within the interpretations available to them. As such, without in any way challenging, jettisoning, or critiquing natural law, the dialectics needed for natural law for concrete people who have to make concrete choices for themselves is to help them have insights which are neither conclusions nor intuitions based upon data which are particularly attentive to the issues surrounding the development of the morality of the person. Not here's the natural law, But if you pay attention to your own intelligence and where it runs poorly, where it runs badly, you'll note the development of your own morality. This is going to be within the dynamics of ongoing social and cultural traditions that promote virtue and practical wisdom, and in which first principles become relevant in the educational sense, the morally formative sense, rather than the theoretical sense. I used to have a teacher who would say, he would laugh at the end, look, if you're trying to argue somebody into faith, it's not going to work. You need to love them into the faith. I'm making an analogy here. You're not going to be able to argue anybody into the natural law. You will have to educate them into their moral agency where they recognize themselves as agents acting for reasons. Yeah? And once they realize that they are agents acting for reasons, then they are able to ask whether they are acting responsibly to those reasons and whether those reasons are sufficient for action. But that's going to occur as the person engages in their own questions about their own integrity within the context of living together. Here's another way of putting this. Natural law is going to have to include a lot more attention paid to the educational role of ethics rather than the theoretical deductive role of ethics. Now, in other words, I'm suggesting we're going to need a lot more Gadamer and a lot less Aquinas when we're doing ethics just now. We're going to need a lot more Paul Ricoeur and a lot less Cicero when we're doing ethics right now. You know who we can keep and who we should put front and center is Augustine in the Confessions. Because Augustine in the Confessions is recounting a personal history of reasons for acting, and when those actions were engaged in intelligently and responsibly and attentively and reasonably. And he discovers his reasons for acting don't work, or his reasons for acting do work. And what he's trying to find, Augustine, what I think is the educational task of natural law now in our hermeneutical situation, is not to worry so much about indemonstrable first principles, but to help people to discover themselves, to introduce them to themselves. But in the words of Rowan Williams, the self is not a substance that one unearths by peeling away layers like an onion until you get to the core, a secret within you sort of peel back to get to. The self, rather, is an integrity that one struggles to bring into existence, which is what we see in the Confessions. That's hermeneutical natural law, the attempt to help people, including ourselves, struggle to bring ourselves into existence with integrity within the limits of our cultural conditions which shape the data that we have available to us. Some of you, I suspect, are going to say that sounds relativistic and maybe even subjectivistic. My response would be, it's just Aristotelian. Thanks all, appreciate it.